Welcome to this video about referendums in Australia. Now, what exactly is a referendum? Well, it's a vote of the people that tells the government what the people want. Now, in Australia, we use this term a bit more precisely these days. So here, a referendum now means a vote that has the direct effect of changing the constitution. We now call other kinds of votes, such as votes about whether to approve same-sex marriage or daylight savings, or even the building of the Franklin Dam, we call them a plebiscite. And that's because they show the government what people want, but they don't directly achieve that outcome. The government and parliament still needs to act to give effect to that decision. But these terms, referendum and plebiscite, weren't always used this precisely. So you will read, for example, about the holding of referendums on things like conscription during World War I, whereas today we'd actually call that a plebiscite because the vote itself didn't change the constitution and didn't actually give effect to any kind of law. So that then brings us to an interesting vexed question, and that is whether or not you say referendums when you're using the plural or referenda. Now, that's something that people quite enjoy arguing about. Now, I used to say referenda, thinking that was the correct plural, but I've later been convinced by an explanation that referendums is actually linguistically correct. So that's probably what I'm going to say here. But personally, I think both of them should be allowed. So I'm not going to get into a fight about it. So hopefully you won't either. Okay. So let's now talk about referendums and changing the constitution. When the constitution was written in the 1890s, the idea of a referendum was actually a very radical one. If the Canadians, for example, wanted to change their constitution, they didn't get a vote of the people to do that. They had to go back to the British Parliament and get it to change their constitution for them because their constitution was contained in a British Act. Now, the Australians, when drafting the constitution, didn't want to do that. They didn't want to have to go back to the British all the time. So they wanted an inbuilt mechanism in the constitution to allow change locally to be done. So then they looked at what the Americans did, and the Americans had quite a complex system of conventions or their state legislatures to allow for constitutional change. And that was the idea that was first taken up here, but a number of people, including Alfred Deakin, convinced the other drafters of the Constitution that instead of leaving this in the hands of the elites, they should in fact trust the people with the ultimate power to change the constitution, and that they should adopt this strange Swiss idea of having a referendum to do it. So our constitution was actually unusually democratic for its time. Now, section 128 of the Constitution says, "This Constitution shall not be altered except in the following manner." And then it sets out the whole referendum process, which we'll go through shortly. Now, this is the only way of formally changing the words of the Constitution. In practice, changes can also happen by courts interpreting the words differently. So over time, meaning can change. But the section 128 mechanism is about dealing with actually changing the words themselves on the page. And you can do that by adding in new provisions, you can remove existing ones, or you can make alterations to the actual words that are in there already, and that's known as making an amendment. And you need a referendum for doing any of those things. So the next question is who gets to start off that process? Who gets to initiate the referendum? Now, section 128 says that the amendment must first be passed by Parliament before it goes to the people. Now, normally this would mean that both houses of Parliament have to approve it, like they do with ordinary legislation. But some of the drafters of the Constitution were worried that one house might block the ability of the other to be able to seek change. So they changed the proposed system so that there are in fact two ways of getting a referendum to the people. Now, under the first simple path, each House of Parliament passes a proposed law, also known as a bill, which sets out the words of the constitutional change. And it must be passed by an absolute majority, which means 50% plus one of the total members of the House, rather than just a majority of those who actually just turned up on the day. Right. So, once it's passed, the proposed law is then sent to a referendum in a period that's not earlier than 2 months after it passed in Parliament and not later than 6 months. And that window in which the referendum can be held ensures that the people get enough time to learn about it before they vote, but not so much time that the issue would become stale. The second path is taken where one of the houses disagrees. So let's call them House A and House B. Let's assume that House A passes a proposed law by an absolute majority, but then House B rejects it or passes it with amendments that House A disagrees with, or fails to pass it. And what does that mean? Well, what happens if it sort of refuses to debate it or delays it or sends it off for a very long time to a parliamentary committee as a way of unreasonably delaying it without formally rejecting it? Okay, well, that's counted as fails to pass. Then, after 3 months, House A again has to pass this proposed law with an absolute majority. And if at that point House B again rejects it or passes it with unacceptable amendments or fails to pass it, then the Constitution says that the Governor-General may submit the bill, as last proposed by House A, to the voters in a referendum. Now, the word may there is important. It gives the Governor-General a choice, and in exercising that choice, the Governor-General is ordinarily advised by government ministers. So while theoretically either house could get a referendum put to the people, even if the other house disagreed, in practice, it's only the lower house, the House of Representatives, that can win in that context. This is because the government almost always controls the lower house and frequently doesn't control the Senate. And it's the government that gets to advise the Governor-General about whether to put the amendment to a referendum. So if the Senate were to pass a referendum bill against the wishes of the government and the House of Representatives, then ministers could advise the Governor-General not to send it to the people in a referendum. And this actually did happen once in 1914. The Governor-General took the advice of the government not to put the amendment to a referendum. And the consequence is that the Senate hasn't really tried since. So what does all this mean? Well, it means that the Commonwealth Government controls whether any constitutional amendment gets to be voted on in a referendum. It also means that the Senate cannot effectively block a referendum passed by the House of Representatives. The fact that the Commonwealth Government controls what goes to a referendum can, however, be problematic. For example, the Commonwealth Government is extremely unlikely ever to ask the people to vote on a referendum that reduces Commonwealth power. The fact that the Commonwealth Government controls what goes to referendum can be problematic. For example, the Commonwealth Government is extremely unlikely ever to ask the people to vote on a referendum that actually reduces the Commonwealth Government's powers. Doesn't matter which side's in power, it's not going to do that. Now, the states also have no chance to initiate referendums, even if the outcome might have favoured state power over the Commonwealth. And the people don't get that chance either, unless, of course, they can convince the Commonwealth Government to support their proposals. So that means that constitutional change can be a bit unbalanced. But it's now virtually impossible to be able to change that, because to change it, what do you need? A referendum. And who initiates it? The Commonwealth Government. Well, what happens next when a proposed law is put to the people in a referendum? First, there are laws about the running of a referendum. One says that before a referendum is held, the government produces a booklet that's sent to voters. It sets out the yes and the no cases, explaining why people should vote for or against the amendment. Each case is drafted by a committee of the politicians that voted that way in Parliament during the passage of the proposed law. And if no one votes no in the Parliament, then there isn't a no case, it's just not published. Now, these yes and no cases are drafted to influence people rather than being objective. They are therefore sometimes emotional, inaccurate, and misleading. So they do need to be read with care. After the campaign comes the vote. Now, because of the way Section 128 is written, the people only get to decide on two options. One is, do you keep the Constitution as it is? And that's going to be a no vote. Or do you approve of the proposed law that contains a specific constitutional change? And that's your yes vote. It's not possible to use a referendum to ask people to decide on a range of different options or to answer a question that's a general principle. They have to vote on whether to approve of a proposed law that sets out the specific words of the change. And this can make the ballot papers a bit confusing to people. The voter is asked whether they approve of a proposed law to do whatever it is. And voters then have to write yes or no in a box beside the question. To pass, a referendum then has to achieve what we call a double majority. So there are two hurdles. The first one is it has to get a majority of all the electors voting across Australia, including electors in the territories. And they need to approve the proposed law for the referendum to pass. Now, informal votes, that means those that are either blank or invalidly filled in, they are not counted in that calculation as they are not valid votes. So the contest is actually only between the yes votes that are valid and the no votes that are valid, and you don't count the other ones at all when working out what the majority is. Now, the second of that double majority is that there needs to be majority approval in a majority of the states. And because we have 6 states, that means 4 out of 6, not 3, 4 out of 6 states have to have majorities approving it. Now, in that count, the territories don't count at all, only the states. Now, this double majority is often blamed for the fact that referendums don't succeed often in Australia, but actually it's not so much the problem. Normally in a referendum, either it's extremely successful or a dismal failure. So it's pretty rare for a referendum to receive an overall majority, but to fail because it wasn't successful in a majority of states. There are also special provisions in Section 128 that say that if a constitutional amendment would reduce the proportionate representation of a state in either House or its minimum number of members in the House of Representatives, or even alter the boundaries of the states, then the approval of a majority of the voters in the affected state must also be received for the referendum to pass. And so that's really a triple majority there for those sorts of things, although we actually haven't ever had a vote on that, so it's never been tried. And the reason it's there is to ensure that certain things can't be done to a state against its will. Now, if a referendum passes, the last step is for the Governor-General to give assent to it. And it then comes into force at whatever date is specified. So sometimes a delay might be needed for it to come into effect so that other legal changes can happen first. So a good example of that was the 1999 Republic referendum. If it had passed, the Republic would not have actually come into effect until the 1st of January in 2001, and the point of that was to give time for all the other details to be worked out in between. But as that particular referendum failed, it ended up not being necessary. Now you know all the technical details about how a referendum works. In other videos, I'll tell you some more about referendums, particularly ones that have been held in the past, the ones that succeeded, the ones that failed, and why. So, click to subscribe for more, and I'll see you soon.